The first 72 hours on death row, how the system breaks men before execution. The moment the sentence is read, the world doesn't end. It narrows. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. In the first 72 hours on death row, men don't scream. They don't collapse. They don't beg. They listen to the sound of keys, to doors that close heavier than any prison gate they've known, to silence, the kind that tells you your life is no longer measured in years, but in procedures. This isn't about execution day. That comes much later. This is about what happens before the uniform, before the routine, before a man even understands where he is. Because in these first 3 days, the system doesn't punish the body. It reprograms the mind. By the time the lights go out on the third night, most inmates haven't been touched, threatened, or harmed. Yet many will later say this was the moment they realized something irreversible had already happened. This is the story of those first 72 hours, and how death row begins breaking men long before execution is even scheduled. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. So don't forget to subscribe and like. Now let's step inside. The sentence and the waiting room. The courtroom is quieter than most people expect. There is no chaos, no shouting, no dramatic collapse. When the judge reads the sentence, the words land cleanly, procedural, almost sterile. Death. A single word delivered in a measured tone, followed by instructions, dates, signatures. For everyone else in the room, it is an ending. For the man standing at the defense table, it is the start of something far less understood. In the minutes after sentencing, nothing visibly changes. The cuffs feel the same. The deputy's hands are steady. The floor is still tile, the lights still fluorescent. There is no dramatic shift in atmosphere. And that is precisely the point. The system does not mark the moment loudly. It lets it pass. Within moments, the condemned inmate is escorted away from the courtroom. Not to death row, not yet, but to a holding area most inmates never see again. A waiting room between worlds. Here, the first rule of death row quietly asserts itself. Nothing happens quickly, and nothing is explained. This space is not designed for comfort or punishment. It is designed for transition. The walls are plain, the bench hard, the air stale. There are no clocks, no windows. Time becomes abstract almost immediately. Guards do not speak unless required. Questions receive neutral answers or none at all. For many inmates, this is the first time the reality begins to settle in. Not because of fear, but because of uncertainty. The legal process is over. Appeals may exist, but they're distant concepts now. What matters is that the system has accepted them as someone who will eventually be killed. And yet, nothing is happening. This delay is not accidental. Psychologists who study incarceration note that the mind struggles most not with violence or confinement, but with unresolved anticipation. The hours after sentencing are filled with administrative pauses, paperwork, coordination, transport logistics. But for the inmate, those hours stretch unnaturally long. Each minute feels like it should bring something definitive. It never does. Eventually, transport is arranged. The ride to death row is rarely direct. In many states, inmates are first processed through a central intake facility or a temporary segregation unit. This journey may take hours or even days, depending on distance and security protocols. During transport, inmates are often shackled more heavily than before, waist chains added, leg irons tightened. Not as punishment, but as classification. The system has quietly reassigned their risk level. No one announces this change. At intake, the process becomes clinical. Personal belongings are inventoried. Clothing is exchanged for standard-issue garments, often different in color from general population uniforms. This distinction matters. Color coding is one of the first visible signals that the inmate has crossed into a separate category, still alive, but no longer treated as part of the broader prison population. Medical screening follows. Vitals are taken. Medical history reviewed. Scars documented. Not for care, but for records. Every mark on the body is logged. Every medication noted. This is not about health alone. It is about accountability. The state must know the condition of the body it now controls for the remainder of the inmate's life. Mental health screening is brief but deliberate. Simple questions, basic orientation checks, not to assess suffering, but to confirm awareness. The system requires the inmate to understand where he is and why he is there. Confusion is corrected. Emotional distress is not. Throughout this process, communication remains minimal. Guards refer to the inmate by last name or number. No one uses the word death. No one explains the timeline. The future remains undefined, and that ambiguity begins to work on the mind. By the time the inmate reaches death row housing, exhaustion has set in, not physical, but cognitive. The brain has been absorbing new rules, new spaces, new silences for hours. Information overload, paired with emotional suppression, creates a state psychologists describe as cognitive numbness. This numbness is functional. It allows compliance. The first cell is often smaller than expected. Concrete walls, steel fixtures, a narrow bed. Some death row units are newer, cleaner, quieter than general population. Others are older, darker, more oppressive. But across facilities, one feature remains consistent: isolation. Even where inmates are housed in proximity to others, interaction is minimal. Doors are solid. Movement is controlled. The environment is intentionally monotonous. There are no visual cues that indicate day or night beyond scheduled lighting changes. When the door closes for the first time, the sound is unmistakable, thicker than standard cell doors, heavier, final in a way the inmate has not heard before. It does not slam, it seals. For many inmates, this is the moment the sentence becomes real, not because of fear of death, but because of permanence. On death row, there is no program track, no earned privileges that lead somewhere else, no behavioral milestones that change classification meaningfully. Good behavior does not shorten the stay. Bad behavior only makes it harder. Time does not move forward, it circles. The first meal arrives quietly, slid through a slot without eye contact. The food is basic, institutional, unremarkable. And yet, many inmates later recall this meal vividly, not for its taste, but because it is the first routine action performed under the new identity, condemned. Sleep does not come easily that first night. The lights may dim, but the mind stays alert. Sounds become sharper. Footsteps echo longer. Distant doors opening and closing register like signals. The inmate listens, not knowing what each sound means or whether it means anything at all. There is no schedule provided, no explanation of the next day. The system offers structure only when it needs compliance. Otherwise, it offers silence. By morning, the second phase begins, not officially but psychologically. The inmate starts to realize that death row is not designed to scare him. It is designed to outlast him. The first 24 hours do not overwhelm through force. They overwhelm through restraint. No yelling, no threats, no violence. Just procedures executed with calm consistency. And that calm is unsettling because it suggests that what has happened is normal. Routine, just another intake, just another number, just another man placed into a system that has done this thousands of times before and will do it thousands of times again. By the end of the first day, most inmates have not cried. They have not screamed. They have not broken down. But something quieter has begun. They have stopped expecting explanation, stopped waiting for reassurance, stopped believing there is a moment when this will suddenly feel real. Because it already does. And the system knows it has succeeded in its first objective. Not to terrify, not to punish, but to make the sentence feel inevitable. Classification, control, and the stripping of identity. By the second day on death row, the inmate begins to understand something the system never explains out loud. This place is not just about confinement. It is about classification. Every movement, every privilege, every restriction is determined by a status that no longer changes. On paper, the inmate is still part of the Department of Corrections. In practice, he has entered a parallel system with its own logic, timelines, and expectations. Death row operates alongside the prison, not within it. The first formal interaction of day 2 is usually classification review. Not a meeting in the traditional sense. There is no discussion, no input, no negotiation. The inmate is informed of his housing status, movement restrictions, and communication limits. These decisions have already been made. The meeting exists only to notify, not to involve. This moment marks the official erasure of individuality. In general population, inmates are classified by behavior, security risk, and institutional history. On death row, classification collapses into a single factor: sentence. It no longer matters how cooperative the inmate has been, what programs he completed, or how he behaved previously. The death sentence overrides all other metrics. The inmate is now managed as an outcome, not a person. Property limits are enforced next. Items allowed in general population, radios, photos, personal books, may be restricted or removed entirely. What remains is standardized. Uniform clothing, approved legal documents, basic hygiene items. Everything else is evaluated through a lens of control. Even personal photos, when allowed, are often limited in size and number. Family faces are reduced to small, faded rectangles. Visual reminders of life outside are permitted only in quantities deemed manageable by the institution. Not for safety, but for order. This reduction is subtle but effective. Psychologists describe identity as something reinforced through choice and personal markers: clothing, possessions, routine decisions. On death row, those markers are systematically stripped away. The inmate does not choose when to eat, when to shower, or when to move. Even reading material may be subject to approval. Over time, the absence of choice creates a cognitive shift. The brain stops evaluating options and begins waiting for instruction. This is not submission, it is adaptation. By mid-morning, routine sets in. Meals arrive at fixed times. Guards conduct visual checks. Count procedures repeat with mechanical consistency. These routines are not designed for engagement. They are designed to establish predictability without comfort. Predictability reduces resistance. One of the most significant changes on day 2 is the realization that communication is now filtered. Conversations with guards are minimal and transactional. Conversations with other inmates, if they occur at all, are indirect, shouted through vents, tapped through walls, or passed via notes when possible. But even these connections are fragile. Death row units are intentionally designed to limit inmate-to-inmate interaction. Solid doors replace bars. Exercise is often conducted alone. Recreation yards, when available, are individual cages rather than shared spaces. The message is consistent. Interaction is a privilege, not a right. For inmates accustomed to prison noise and social dynamics, the quiet becomes oppressive. Sound, or the lack of it, takes on new meaning. The absence of voices creates a vacuum the mind fills on its own. Thoughts loop, memories replay, hypothetical futures intrude. Without distraction, the inmate is left alone with his internal narrative, and that narrative rarely shows mercy. This is when many inmates begin mentally revisiting their trial, not for legal strategy, but for emotional reconstruction. They replay testimony, facial expressions, moments they missed while sitting at the defense table. The mind searches for meaning, closure, or error. It finds none. The system does not interrupt this process. It allows it to unfold naturally. Medical follow-ups often occur on the second day. Not treatment, monitoring, blood pressure checks, medication adjustments if necessary. Mental health staff may stop by, but interactions are brief. Their role is not therapeutic. It is observational. The institution is not concerned with emotional healing. It is concerned with stability. An inmate who breaks down becomes unpredictable. Unpredictability disrupts order. Therefore, the goal is containment, not recovery. Emotional distress is noted, logged, and managed only if it threatens institutional routine. By afternoon, the inmate may receive his first explanation of death row rules. Not verbally, but through paperwork. Typed pages outlining prohibited actions, grievance procedures, and disciplinary consequences. The language is formal and impersonal. There is no acknowledgement of the sentence itself. The rules speak as though the inmate will be here indefinitely, and in practice he will be. Death row sentences often last decades. Appeals, retrials, stays, and legal delays stretch the timeline far beyond initial expectations. Many inmates will grow old here. Some will die of natural causes long before execution becomes imminent. The system is designed with this reality in mind. That is why death row is not built as a place of constant terror. It is built as a place of long-term psychological erosion. Fear burns out quickly. Routine does not. As evening approaches on the second day, the inmate begins noticing small details he missed before. The rhythm of guard shifts. The sound of carts rolling down the tier. The way doors open in a precise sequence. These observations are not curiosity. They are coping mechanisms. The mind searches for patterns to regain a sense of control. Dinner arrives. Another institutional tray. Another meal eaten in silence. By now, hunger is no longer the primary driver. Eating becomes an obligation rather than a desire. Skipping meals feels like surrender. Eating feels like compliance. The inmate chooses compliance. Night falls again. Sleep comes easier than the first night, but it is lighter. Fragmented. Dreams are interrupted by count checks and distant noise. When the inmate wakes, he is briefly disoriented, forgetting where he is, until the cell walls remind him. This momentary confusion is significant. It is one of the last signs that the mind is still resisting full acceptance. Over time, even this disorientation will disappear. Waking on death row will feel normal. By the end of day 2, the inmate understands something fundamental. This place does not need to threaten him. It does not need to explain itself. It simply exists, operating at a pace that makes resistance exhausting. The identity he carried into the courtroom, father, son, worker, citizen, has not been violently taken away. It has been quietly rendered irrelevant. He is no longer someone serving time. He is someone waiting without a clear date. Waiting without control, waiting inside a system that measures its success not by what it does to him, but by how little it needs to do at all. And that realization settles in deeper than fear ever could. Isolation, time distortion, and the quiet collapse. By the third day on death row, the inmate is no longer reacting. He is adjusting. This shift is subtle, but it marks one of the most important psychological transitions in the entire process. Fear spikes early. Shock follows. But by day 3, the brain begins doing what it does best under sustained pressure. It recalibrates expectations. Isolation is no longer new. It is now the default. On death row, isolation is rarely framed as punishment. It is presented as necessity, security, protocol, safety. The inmate is not told he is being isolated. He is told this is simply how death row functions. The distinction matters because it removes any sense that the condition can be argued against or appealed. This is not something being done to him. This is something that is. The cell becomes the entire world. The boundaries are fixed and unchanging. A few steps from wall to wall. A bed bolted to concrete. A sink and toilet combined into a single steel unit. There are no choices to make about space, because there is no space to choose from. At first, the mind fights this confinement by staying alert. Every sound is cataloged. Every movement outside the door is tracked. The inmate listens constantly, trying to understand the rhythm of the tier. Who walks when? Which sounds belong to guards, and which belong to other inmates. By day 3, that vigilance begins to fade. Not because the environment becomes safer, but because constant alertness is unsustainable. The brain cannot remain in a heightened state indefinitely. When nothing changes, the mind conserves energy by narrowing focus. This is where time begins to distort. Without access to clocks, phones, or regular human interaction, time loses its familiar structure. Hours stretch unevenly. Minutes drag, then disappear. Sleep and wake cycles blur. The inmate may nap during the day and lie awake at night, unsure whether he has slept too much or not enough. Meals become the only reliable markers of passing time. Breakfast means morning. Dinner means evening. Everything else exists in a vague, floating space between. This fragmentation of time perception is not accidental. Studies on isolation environments, submarines, polar stations, long-term confinement show that when time loses definition, the mind becomes easier to manage. Confused time reduces resistance. On the third day, the inmate also begins to understand that interaction is not just limited, it is discouraged. Requests are met with delays. Questions are answered briefly, if at all. Conversations with staff remain strictly functional. No small talk. No acknowledgement beyond what is required. This emotional neutrality is intentional. Guards on death row are trained to maintain distance, not out of cruelty, but to preserve order. Emotional engagement invites unpredictability. Distance keeps the system stable. The inmate feels this immediately, not as hostility, but as absence. There is no one to react to his presence. The lack of feedback becomes its own form of pressure. Humans are social creatures by design. Even negative interaction reinforces existence. Silence does not. When no one responds emotionally, positively or negatively, the sense of self begins to erode. The inmate may speak out loud, just to hear a human voice. He may pace, stretch, repeat movements. These behaviors are not signs of breakdown. They're attempts at grounding. But over time, even these actions slow. Thoughts begin looping. The mind revisits the same memories again and again, not because they offer comfort, but because they are familiar. Childhood scenes, past relationships, moments from before incarceration. The brain clings to known narratives as a defense against the emptiness of the present. This replay is not healing. It is preservation. At some point during the third day, many inmates report a moment of emotional flattening. Not despair, not panic, a dull, muted calm. This is often misunderstood as acceptance. It is not. It is psychological withdrawal. When the mind cannot escape a situation physically, it creates distance internally. Emotional responses soften. Reactions become delayed. The inmate may notice that thoughts which once triggered anger or fear now register weakly, if at all. This is the beginning of dissociation. The system does not intervene when this happens. From an institutional perspective, a quieter inmate is a compliant inmate. As long as rules are followed and no disruption occurs, there is no reason to interfere. The third day also introduces the realization that help, if needed, will not come automatically. Mental health services exist, but they are reactive, not proactive. Unless the inmate exhibits extreme behavior, no one checks in meaningfully. The message is implicit: manage yourself. By now, the condemned inmate understands that death row is not actively hostile. It does not attack. It does not provoke. It simply removes everything that once made emotional regulation possible. No privacy, no spontaneity, no future planning. Without these anchors, the mind floats. Physical sensations begin to change as well. Hunger signals dull. Fatigue becomes constant but unsatisfying. Sleep does not refresh. The body exists in a state of low-level stress, never fully relaxed, never fully alert. This prolonged state wears down mental resilience. By evening of the third day, the inmate may stop asking questions entirely. Not because he has answers, but because he understands that answers do not change outcomes. Curiosity fades. Initiative fades with it. The cell door closes again for the night. This time, the sound does not trigger the same reaction it did before. It is no longer shocking. It is expected. The inmate does not brace himself. He does not listen as closely. This desensitization is dangerous, not because it causes immediate harm, but because it signals a deeper shift. The environment has begun to feel permanent, and permanence changes behavior. Hope becomes abstract. Appeals, lawyers, and future court dates exist only as concepts, not lived realities. The inmate knows intellectually that legal processes continue, but emotionally, they feel distant and unreliable. What feels real is the cell, the routine, the silence. By the end of the third day, The inmate has not been threatened, assaulted, or overtly punished. And yet, something fundamental has changed. He no longer measures time by events. He no longer expects explanation. He no longer waits for relief. The system has accomplished something critical without force or spectacle. It has taught him that endurance, not resistance, is the only viable response. And once that lesson settles in, death row no longer needs to break him loudly. It could do it quietly. Routine without reward and the erosion of hope. By the fourth day on death row, the inmate has stopped asking himself when something will happen. That question no longer feels useful. Instead, a quieter realization takes hold. This place runs whether he engages with it or not. The routines continue with or without his cooperation. Meals arrive. Counts are conducted. Lights change. The system does not require participation, only compliance. This is the point where routine begins to do its deepest work. In most prisons, routine offers something in return. Good behavior leads to privileges. Time served leads to transfer. Participation leads to movement. On death row, routine offers nothing. There is no progression built into the system. Days stack on top of one another without visible outcome. The inmate begins to understand that effort no longer produces change. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It creeps in through repetition. Another identical breakfast. Another identical count. Another identical hour staring at the same wall. Over time, the brain learns that anticipation is wasted energy. So it shuts anticipation down. This is not resignation. It is efficiency. Guards notice the shift before the inmate does. He moves less, speaks less. His requests become shorter and less frequent. Not because he is content, but because he has learned which actions produce results and which do not. Most produce none. By day 4, the inmate also becomes acutely aware of how privileges are framed. Access to a shower, a limited amount of recreation, occasional phone calls. These are not rights. They are permissions, granted, revoked, delayed. The uncertainty surrounding these small allowances creates a constant, low-grade tension. The inmate never knows whether something will be available until it happens. Planning becomes impossible. Without the ability to plan, hope has nowhere to anchor. Psychologically, hope depends on expectation. When outcomes are predictable, the mind invests emotionally. When outcomes are arbitrary, the mind withdraws. Death row routines are designed to feel predictable in structure, but unpredictable in outcome. This combination is destabilizing. Mail, when it arrives, becomes a double-edged experience. Letters from family carry familiarity and pain in equal measure. They remind the inmate of a world that continues without him. A world that changes while he remains static. Some inmates ration letters, reading them slowly, saving paragraphs for later. Others avoid them altogether, finding that the emotional cost outweighs the comfort. There is no correct response. Both are survival strategies. The institution does not interfere either way. By the afternoon of the 4th day, the inmate begins to sense the absence of milestones. There is no orientation completion, no status update, no moment where someone says, "You've made it through the hardest part." The hardest part does not end. This absence is intentional. Milestones create a sense of progress. Progress creates resilience. Death row removes both. Instead, time becomes a flat surface, something to be endured rather than navigated. Physical movement is limited and controlled. Recreation, when permitted, occurs alone or in small enclosures. The inmate may step outside into a caged yard, see the sky through fencing, and feel something stir, only for it to fade when he is escorted back inside. These moments are not relief. They are reminders. The body begins to mirror the mind's withdrawal. Muscles soften from inactivity. Posture changes. The inmate may stop maintaining personal appearance beyond what is required. Grooming becomes functional, not expressive. This physical simplification reflects an internal shift. Identity is no longer reinforced through daily action. In general population, inmates define themselves through roles: worker, student, mentor, troublemaker. On death row, There are no roles to assume. There is only presence. By the evening count, the inmate understands something deeply unsettling. Nothing about his behavior today changed tomorrow. Nothing he did mattered beyond the moment it occurred. This realization does not produce panic. It produces detachment. Detachment is safer than disappointment. At this stage, thoughts about execution may surface more clearly, not as fear, but as abstraction. The inmate may imagine it in clinical terms, stripped of emotion. Procedures, timelines, logistics. This mental distancing is protective. Emotionally engaging with death constantly would be unbearable. The mind learns to compartmentalize. The system benefits from this adaptation. An inmate who compartmentalizes is easier to manage. He follows rules. He avoids conflict. He fades into the background of the institution. Night falls again. The cell feels familiar now, not comforting, but known. The sounds no longer startle. The light patterns no longer confuse. The inmate's body has adjusted to the environment's rhythm. This familiarity is dangerous because it signals normalization. Once something becomes normal, it becomes acceptable, not morally but psychologically. The mind stops protesting conditions it perceives as stable. By the end of the fourth day, hope has not disappeared completely. It has simply lost urgency. It exists in theory, not practice. Appeals may succeed someday. Laws may change. Outcomes may shift. But none of that affects today. And death row operates in the present tense. The system does not ask the inmate to give up hope. It simply gives him no place to use it. And in that vacuum, hope begins to thin, not because it is crushed, but because it is starved. Acceptance without consent and the point of no return. By the fifth day on death row, the most dangerous change has already occurred. The inmate has stopped resisting internally. This does not mean he agrees with his sentence. It does not mean he has given up legally or emotionally. What it means is more subtle and far more permanent. His mind has accepted the environment as fixed, even if the future remains uncertain. This is acceptance without consent. On the surface, nothing appears different. The routines continue unchanged. Meals arrive on schedule. Counts are conducted. Doors open and close with mechanical precision. But beneath this stability, a psychological line has been crossed. The inmate no longer measures himself against who he was before arriving. During the first days, thoughts often begin with "I used to." By day 5, those thoughts fade. Not because the memories are gone, but because they no longer feel connected to the present self. The inmate begins to experience his past as something belonging to another person, someone who lived under different rules in a different world. This separation is not accidental. It is how the mind protects itself from prolonged stress. When reality cannot be changed, identity adjusts instead. The inmate begins thinking in smaller units of time. Not weeks, not years, hours, tasks, moments. He focuses on what must be done next. Eat, stand for count, lie down, wait. This narrowing of attention is functional. Big picture thinking invites despair. Small picture thinking allows survival. The system rewards this adjustment by functioning smoothly around him. There is no conflict to resolve, no friction to address. From an institutional perspective, the inmate has stabilized. From a human perspective, something essential has been surrendered. By now, the cell feels less like confinement and more like a boundary. The inmate moves within it instinctively. He knows where to sit, where to stand, how to sleep without hitting concrete edges. The body adapts quickly when given no alternatives. This bodily familiarity reinforces psychological acceptance. The inmate may even notice moments of calm, brief, unsettling calm, a sense that nothing is expected of him beyond existing. These moments can feel like relief, but they carry a cost. Relief in a place like this is purchased with disengagement. By day 5, many inmates stop imagining escape, not physically but mentally. Fantasies about being somewhere else lose detail. The mind no longer invests energy in worlds it cannot reach. This is not hopelessness. It is conservation. Hope still exists, but it is relocated. It moves away from the present and into distant, abstract spaces, courtrooms not yet scheduled, laws not yet written, futures not yet defined. Hope becomes a concept rather than a feeling. One of the clearest signs of this shift is how the inmate responds to silence. Early on, silence felt heavy, threatening. By day 5, silence becomes neutral. It is simply the background state of existence. The absence of stimulation no longer alarms the nervous system. The body's stress response has recalibrated downward, not because danger has passed, but because constant activation is unsustainable. This recalibration is often mistaken for resilience. In reality, it is habituation. The inmate has learned what death row demands. Not fear, not obedience, but endurance. And endurance requires a different psychological posture than resistance. Requests for information become rare. Complaints stop. Questions feel pointless. The inmate has learned, through experience, that understanding does not alter outcomes. What alters outcomes is patience. By the end of the 5th day, the inmate has internalized the most important rule of death row. Time belongs to the institution now. Days will move at its pace, not his. Progress will occur invisibly, if at all. This realization changes how the inmate views himself. He no longer sees himself as someone temporarily placed in this environment. He sees himself as someone defined by it. Death row is no longer a phase, it is a condition. This is the point of no return. Even if appeals succeed years later, even if sentences are overturned or commuted, many inmates report that they never fully leave death row psychologically. The adaptations made here do not reverse easily. The mind does not forget how to survive in silence. Night falls again. The cell door closes, and the sound registers as expected. Not final, not dramatic, just routine. The inmate lies down, aware that tomorrow will mirror today with near precision. And that awareness no longer shocks him. He has not been forced into this state. He has not been threatened into compliance. He has simply been given no alternative. By the end of the first 72 hours, death row has not destroyed him. It has done something quieter and more lasting. It has reshaped how he relates to time, how he relates to hope, how he relates to himself. And once that reshaping is complete, the system no longer needs to assert control. It already has it. What the first 72 hours really do. When people think about death row, they imagine execution chambers, last meals, and final words. They imagine an ending. But what actually defines death row begins long before any of that becomes real. It begins quietly in those first 72 hours when nothing dramatic happens and nothing needs to be explained. There are no threats, no spectacles, no violence required. The system does not rush. It waits, because waiting is the point. In those first 3 days, the body is not attacked. The mind is not openly broken. Instead, something more effective takes place. Identity is reduced. Time is stripped of meaning. Hope is relocated so far into the future that it no longer interferes with the present. By the time an inmate understands what death row truly is, he has already adapted to it. This is why death row is so difficult to describe from the outside. It does not feel like punishment in the way people expect. It feels like suspension, a state where life continues, but direction disappears, where days move forward without leading anywhere. For many inmates, the first 72 hours become the psychological blueprint for everything that follows. The routines learned here are repeated for years. The silences learned here grow deeper over time. The acceptance learned here becomes permanent, even when circumstances change. This is the part of the system that rarely makes headlines. Court decisions are public. Executions are public. But this slow psychological restructuring happens behind closed doors, carried out through routine, isolation, and time. It leaves no visible marks and produces no dramatic footage. Yet its effects last longer than any sentence ever could. Understanding this matters, not because it excuses crimes or minimizes victims, but because it reveals how power actually works in closed systems. Control does not always come from force. Often, it comes from consistency, from patience, from environments designed to outlast resistance. Death row is not just a place where men wait to die. It is a place where men are taught how to wait. And once waiting becomes normal, the system no longer needs to enforce obedience. It simply maintains the conditions that make obedience inevitable. That is what the first 72 hours accomplish. They do not end a life. They redefine it. And by the time the rest of the world begins paying attention, the most important transformation has already taken place. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.